All right, welcome back to the Now Morning Show here on TTT. Yes, we're trying to mask up, you know how it is. Let's not pretend like we don't know, okay? All right. I know nobody in here not have no COVID. We're trying to make sure nobody not get no COVID. Okay, great. So that outside of the way, in this morning's Spotlight, we'll be speaking to Mr. Valmiki Arjun, lecturer in finance at the University of the West Indies, because we saw Fitch Solutions put out a report that is suggesting that the short-term outlook and the long-term outlook for Trinidad and Tobago will all be stymied by one, the rollout of vaccines, and two, the Forex shortage. So we just wanted to pay some attention to that to see how it's going to be affecting investors' confidence. So let me say good morning to Mr. Valmiki Arjun. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, good morning, Ms. Legore, and good morning to all your viewers as well.
Thank you so much. Natalie, though, Miss Legore in Jamaica, you know, you've ever seen her? We had her up on screen the other day celebrating a nice birthday, you know.
Okay. I actually know another Miss Legore from Jamaica, someone I did my studies with back in the UK.
Oh, really?
So I don't know if there's any relation there.
It might be. I mean, it's not a very popular name, you know. So far, everybody named Legore seem to be related to some way, somehow. So,
okay. Well, it is a small world, that.
Yeah. So talk to us. When you saw that report that Fitch put out, at least what we saw of the report, what do you think of the projections that it's making regarding Trinidad and Tobago? Accurate?
Well, I think their report is primarily predicated on a projected growth of about 4.4% this year. Now, that analysis was initially published by Fitch in June. So it's well over a month old. But I think 4.4% is a bit too optimistic at this particular point in time, especially given that there are several key obstacles to the growth of the private sector, to activities and in fact of the private sector that we would have seen primarily coming out of last year and this year's effects of the pandemic. Now, of course, the very first and foremost obstacle that we have to get over is the vaccine hesitancy and the ability to properly inoculate the majority of our population, at least aiming for about a 70 to 80% of our population. Of course, we're very well aware that vaccine hesitancy is still a big impediment in our way for doing this. I mean, now we're in a position that we actually have vaccine supplies coming into the country. Before we were complaining that we don't have vaccines. Now we do actually have vaccines. There's still quite a bit of hesitancy to get that shot in the person's arm. I mean, when you don't have a workforce in particular that's properly inoculated, we're of course seeing the retail sector to be reopened very soon, which to me, of course, as an economist, is very, very positive news and very welcoming news, especially for the private sector and their employees. But when you don't have a workforce that's properly inoculated, you're looking at taking a very big risk, or people are taking a very big risk in that infection rates could start to go back up again, especially when they're at work. So you're going to find that persons in the workforce are going to, many of them could very well have to start to quarantine again.
Yeah.
Some, and especially if they're infected, they get hospitalized again. And so it negatively affects your workforce, which and let's not forget that our real most valuable resource in this country is not oil and gas. It's our human resource. It's us, the people of the country. So when an infection like this takes such a negative effect on the labor force, it naturally affects your lives, your livelihoods, the productivity in the workplace, the ability, the production flow and the workflow in the workplace.
Yeah.
So then there are effects like your production levels fall, and you can't, for example, in the manufacturing sector, you may not be able to fulfill all your orders, etc. But of course, we've seen the manufacturing sector take the lead with this vaccination process and inoculate a large majority, if not all, of their workforce again. And when you don't have a population as a whole that is properly inoculated, it tends to lower the confidence, not just among the local community, especially local investing community, but of course within among the foreign investors as well that may be looking at Trinidad as a particular destination for future investment.
Right, and that's the point I was making, that, you know, when we look at what Fitch is saying, Fitch Solutions, it's literally saying, listen, when you look at the short-term outlook for Trinidad and Tobago with this vaccine hesitancy, that is definitely going to lower the growth rate or the prospects for growth for the country.
Correct.
And when you look
Correct.
at the long-term outlook, the Forex shortage is definitely going to affect that, because we know how difficult it is for businesses to get foreign exchange, to get that US dollar to do their business. But apart from that, you mentioned the key point, about, that the human resource is, the backbone of any country. And we have this vaccine hesitancy that's real. And even the Minister of Health was talking about it, that we went down from 15,000 vaccinations per week to 4,500. And if you look at that report coming out in June, and June, where we were with vaccinations compared to now August, I think Fitch might have to do a second report.
Well, the fact of the matter is that because of the fluidity, how dynamic this pandemic is, it changes much, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, it changes all across the world. It changes the dynamic of economic growth and the other economic fundamentals that countries are facing. So, for example, if you look at India, India was actually projected to grow by well over 8% in this particular year. But then there's a big question mark over that, especially now because of the implications of the pandemic and the death toll that it had on that particular
You know what, Mr. Arjun? Let us discuss this, because I'm thinking to myself that we have these rating agencies and we have these businesses that look at countries and their prospects for growth and stuff, and Fitch Solutions does this. But when I look at the 4.4% that you mentioned, they were talking about growth in the short term, that they expected that 4.4%. The reality is, we're saying that, that is too optimistic, but somehow they normally come up with these figures based on their experience and based on what they do. Why do we say it's too optimistic, though? Because maybe they're seeing, because Fitch did take into consideration the slow rollout of vaccines. It did take into consideration the Forex shortage.
The slow rollout of vaccine, while it is a very fundamental reason, it's not the only reason that we have to take into account. When we look at our overall macroeconomic picture, remember, we are coming out of the effects of not just one lockdown, but two lockdowns.
Yeah.
So when you look at the implications of that on the private sector, many of them last year would have found themselves in deep financial stress because of the very first lockdown. And then to have to come back to not one, but two in the space of 2 years is going to be extraordinarily difficult for them. So many were not able to reopen their doors last year. Those that have were, of course, not in a very encouraging financial position. And then you find that you have to close down again. So what we would see coming out of this second lockdown is that many other businesses, especially among the micro and small and medium-sized entities, they may not very well be in a very safe or relatively safe financial position to be able to reopen their doors. And that, of course, will have negative implications for our growth. Now, when you look at Fitch's analysis, a lot of it is primarily predicated on the performance of the energy sector. Now, when we look at some of the data, we would have seen a drop in natural gas production. It's about 20.6% lower in the first quarter of this particular year relative to the first quarter of last year. Oil production, however, is a bit marginally higher. It's gone up on average from about 56.67 barrels per day last year to about 58.9 barrels per day this year. But LNG production is now about 39% lower. But I just want to shift the gear a little bit to go to the non-energy sector, because a lot of times we tend to overlook this very critical component. Our economy is basically energy into non-energy. And it's very interesting, something you said earlier about the vaccination rollout, because what we're seeing in other countries, particularly the developed world like the United States, because of the level of vaccination that they would have, full inoculation rather, that they would have gotten to, they of course would have crossed that 40% threshold a while ago. The reason I say a threshold of 40%, not that we should be aiming to stop at 40%, we should be aiming to go as high as we can possibly get. But what we've seen globally is that when you get to that 40% mark, countries have started to reopen their economy more jobs have started to be created. And as a result of that, what we're seeing is a serious pent-up demand, what you call a revenge demand then, where people, to make up for the loss in consumption last year, people have reattained their jobs. Some have gotten new jobs in the United States alone, has created over 880,000 jobs in 1 month because of their reopening of the economy, simply because they were able to inoculate a large percentage of the population.
But at this point,
people are getting back their jobs, should be getting back their jobs at some point in time, which will enable them to have the purchasing power to be able to start back their consumption activities, and businesses would have the incomes coming in to start back their investment activities gradually.
No, well, at this point, I think according to the Ministry of Health, we're at about 30% in terms of first shots. So just now we'll reach that 40% if we're able to get people out. I'm seeing some MPs doing this.
Keep that in mind.
Right, so I'm seeing some people, deciding to help their constituencies to get them out to be vaccinated. And of course, the appeal is there. So I think if we're able to get across that threshold with the hesitancy and get to that 40%, not just for first shots, because but for first and second shots, then I think, right, and we see the retail sector, it's going to be reopened the 16th of August. So that means that there will be some more activity in the economy. And, especially when it comes onto the services sector, I'm looking forward to that reopening as well, all the barbershops and the hairdressers and all these people, because, the services sector contributes to 60% to GDP. And I think a lot of times people keep forgetting just how critical it is to the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. So I think we have a lot that we can do, and I think that there's a lot that can happen where we can see things kind of picking up, so that this Fitch report and the outlook, even though to me, as you said, you think that it's quite, optimistic.
I'm happy to see that. It's still optimistic at this point,
But
because there's another key factor that it did not allude to, and which I'm actually quite surprised, because when you look at all the international economic analyses and the international business media, almost every week they point out to this critical problem, this big elephant in the room that we have now. The second elephant in the room, I like to put it, the first elephant is the vaccination problems that we're having. The second one is that we are still finding some serious supply chain problems happening globally, where, for example, if you're involved in manufacturing activities, they're finding it quite difficult to still acquire their raw materials on time, their equipment on time, to be able to facilitate their production operations in order to meet whatever orders they may have. And the reason is this, that because of that pent-up demand that we're finding globally, for example, in China, their manufacturing activities would have grown by about 38.6% just in the space of 1 month. And the reason for that is because they're getting some very large purchase orders from across the world, particularly from those countries that were able to reopen their economies. But suppliers can only meet a particular percentage of those orders for raw materials and equipment, etc. So they can't really meet our demand for it as timely as we would like it to be.
Actually, this week, Mr. Arjun, I'm going to be spending a little time this week speaking to Mr. Michael Schultz, looking at, just the supply chain and how this supply chain and the disruption has affected food prices. Because if you notice, food prices in Trinidad and Tobago are way out of whack. But before
and they're going to be out of whack even further in the coming months. Right now, distributors and large supermarket chains, because of the competition that they have amongst themselves, they've been trying. That competition has helped to somewhat suppress, but marginally suppress, the extent of price increases that we ought to be seeing. But that they could only sustain that for a particular point, up to a particular point.
Mr. Arjun, we just have about a minute left, and we haven't even touched on the Forex shortage, because, as I said, it's one of the things that Fitch Solutions looked at to determine the short-term and long-term outlook for Trinidad and Tobago. And
we've seen an increase in the oil in oil prices, particularly
which is supposed
over the course of the first 6 months of this year. So it has supposed to help. And what we've seen is that authorized dealers have purchased an additional $2.5 billion US dollars. In the system, there's an additional $2.5 billion now that authorized dealers would have purchased, which should ideally mean that they should be in a better place to assist manufacturers and also the retailers to acquire added Forex to meet their expenditure obligations, their import obligations in particular. That pent-up demand that I spoke about, especially in the United States, our largest trading partner, that presents us with an excellent opportunity. If we were to capitalize on that pent-up demand and be able to increase our production to be able to satisfy some of that consumption needs happening in the United States. Given our size, we will be able to meet all of it.
I think it will happen. Because
optimistically, let us hope so. Because the foreign exchange, our exports have gone up, especially primarily because of the activities in the manufacturing sector being able to somewhat tap in to the massive pent-up demand happening in other countries right now. But again, it has not gone up to the level that we should find encouraging. But what would help them to be able to meet this increase in production demand for their particular goods that they produce is if they have better access to foreign exchange, especially now so that the cost of transportation, international shipping costs, container costs, and even trucking costs have increased substantially. They need the foreign exchange.
Yes. So you know what? Let us hope that 2.5 billion X additional based on the price of oil and even gas, that we've been seeing some rebounds there in the energy sector. Let us hope that those will help us so that we can, meet the demands of foreign exchange. Because if not, we're going to be in a tailspin. But Mr. Arjun, I have to thank you so much for being with us here this morning. And hopefully we'll be able to continue the conversation at some other time.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're most welcome. Valmiki Arjun, they're talking to us about the outlook for Trinidad and Tobago based on Fitch Solutions. And you know what? He says the 4.4% that Fitch is, anticipating in the short term. He believes that it's too optimistic based on the fact that we still have vaccine hesitancy. A lot of the sectors, some sectors still closed, and all the other factors that might affect business. But he's hoping that we'll get to that stage like the US and those people where you have people want to revenge buy when things reopen.
A lot of people are already planning that.
Yep. So I see
people saying they can't wait for next week Monday. They're so excited. So much people say they couldn't wait for this Monday.
Yeah,
so
because if you're talking about reopening schools, you have to ensure that these places are open so that you can get a little school uniform, books, your little books and stuff like that.
Yeah, stationery, etc.
So, I am staying away from everywhere for the next 2 weeks.
I hear you.
People going to be out and about. I good. All right, guys, we are going to take a break. We have a lot more coming up in the program. Remember, today we're going to be speaking about World Indigenous People Day, and I know you probably want to know